So, silly hippies. Right? Silly hippies, and not just silly hippies, right? But undisciplined too. Yes, yes, and not just that, right? If we've been listening carefully, not just undisciplined, but also attention-seeking exhibitionists, and not just that too, but dangerous, dangerous. In other words, no one's quite sure what to make of them. And I'm not talking this morning about we Unitarian Universalists, by the way. Sorry, I just had to do that. No, we're talking, right, as I've said right away, about the Occupy Wall Street gang, which has now grown far beyond Wall Street. And even as we've talked now with our witness on yesterday, it's even come to our city. Which is why I think it's especially important today to really think together and hard and figure out what exactly it is we're looking at with this movement, right? Because if we are going to engage it or support it or be a part of it in any way, it's absolutely important that we all, to some degree, have a sense of what we're looking at. But again, no one, right, so far is quite sure what they are looking at, but everybody, right, everybody has an opinion. And I'm sure if you've been following this, they're not really all that favorable so far. And I'm not just talking here about what Fox News has to say. You know, the criticisms so far, somewhat surprisingly, have been leveled by both the left and the right. And while I've got to say this morning right away that I found most of these criticisms themselves pretty silly, there are two in particular that I think we need to especially lift up and wrestle with and think about today, especially as religious people. And the first one, the first serious one that I want to lift up comes from the left, from those you think would have been an immediate, right? Immediate and unanimous cheerleaders of this movement, but it hasn't quite turned out this way. This is the group that I call the get rid of the kitchen sink crowd. I think some of you can imagine this group if you've been following it, right? This is the group that is usually voiced, or this is the group that usually voices their concerns. These are veteran activists, maybe those who have marched in civil rights before or against the Vietnam, or they're also made up of longtime union organizers. And to be fair, one must say that theirs is intended, right, as constructive criticism, even if the implicit condescension is barely veiled. Most often goes something like this: we are just so glad you kids are here. Right? Imagine at this moment a self-appointed responsible adult patting a little child on the head. We so admire, we so admire your spunk, but to be effective, kids, to be effective, you really got to focus your demands. A grocery list of grievances will not do. Real change, this group has been telling the Occupy Wall Street gang, real change happens only when you put your collective power behind a few carefully chosen goals. Sounds familiar from what you've been reading? Yes? A little. You've heard this, right? And here, I'm sure as you've been following, here's the interesting thing, right? So far, these so-called naive kids and newbie activists have politely thanked their well-meaning mentors and in effect said, that's okay, we're fine with the way things are. With signs, right? If you've noticed all the pictures, they've been fine with the way things are, and they've been fine with the diversity and not narrowing by holding up signs, right? Protesting everything from Wall Street to tar sands drilling to defense spending and also to firing teachers and social workers. In fact, one of the favorite signs that I've seen so far from the ones I've looked at is a sign that was held up by one young man who said, "We are not disorganized. America just has too many issues." Not so bad. So that's the curious thing about, it's one of the most curious things about this entire movement, right? This refusal to narrow, and we'll come back to that in a little bit, and a little later. But there's also this second major criticism, right? This one comes from the right and is probably expressed best by the New York Times columnist, the conservative New York Times columnist David Brooks. You know, the conservative columnist who liberals usually disagree with, but just think he's just such a darn swell guy, you know? David Brooks, in this case, though, I'm not feeling is all that swell, because he too frames the protesters as juvenile, right? But for him, his angle's a little bit different. For him, their childish mood lies in the way that they are treating things, with the Occupy Wall Street crowd are treating things as a simplistic, Harry Potter-like battle between the evil few and the innocent, virtuous many. Taking aim at the Occupy Wall Street's primary slogan, "We are the 99%." People recognize that as maybe if there's any slogan that the group has gotten behind, it's that one the most. We are the 99%. But taking aim at that slogan, Brooks writes this. He says, this slogan allows the protesters to think very highly of themselves and believe that all their problems are caused by the nefarious elite. Unfortunately, almost no problem can be productively conceived this way. A group, he goes on to write, that divides the world between the pure, right, the pure 99% and the evil 1% will have nothing to say about education reform, Medicare reform, tax reform, wage stagnation, or polarization. They will have nothing. They will have nothing to say about the way all Americans have overconsumed and overborrowed. These are problems that implicate a much broader swath of society than the top 1%. It's about changing, he writes, about changing behavior from the top to the bottom. Let's occupy ourselves. Not easy to dismiss, right? Again, something worth us wrestling with. And added to that, while Brooks does not go on to say this himself, other conservative colleagues of his have used his line of argument and expanded it to frame the occupiers as dangerous. When a large group, they say, when a large group paints itself as innocent and pure, they stress, it just does not take much to justify violence. Just watch, this group says, importantly. Just watch. It's only a matter of time before this hippie love fest turns into an angry mob that starts pulling Wall Street bankers from their cars and enacts their own form of vigilante justice. And friends, here's where that thing I said about us being religious people comes in, because we all know, right, that all the great religions, every single one of them warn us against such simplistic villainizing and scapegoating. What's that famous quote? The one that ends with, "The line dividing good and evil cuts through every human heart." We know this, right? We know this. And so without a doubt, right, we need to take, I think, this critique seriously. And no doubt we need to watch for it carefully and urge against it. But here's the thing. Maybe not watch for it too carefully. Else we might end up seeing what others want us to see rather than what might be entirely new. See, that's what I've been struggling with in the midst of this, with all these sort of preconceived critiques. There's a way in which we have to watch for them, but not buy into them too much, or else I think we'll miss what might be entirely different and entirely new about this movement. Which brings me to a favorite quote of mine that's often hung beside the desk, mine and Karen's desk, that sits in our office. It reads this. It says, "If a person isn't given a chance to say, 'I hurt,' they will inevitably say, 'I hate.'" If a person is not given the chance to say, "I hurt," they will inevitably say, "I hate." For the past few weeks, as I've been watching and following and wrestling with the Occupy Wall Street movement, I just haven't been able to get that singular quote out of my head. It's been coming back into my head over and over again. And I should say right away, right up front, that Karen and I have most often used this quote as a guide to church leadership, not so much political assessment or analysis, recognizing that in a growing church like ours, things change, right? And when things change, people can feel left behind or like they don't count anymore. And when things they liked, or things that gave them status or a feeling of home disappear, I think as we all know, when that happens, folks don't just experience loss, right? They feel loss.